beneath the towering pines of an endless American wilderness, she lived half a lifetime in silence, widowed, forgotten, her voice a whisper to the wind. But one evening, as dusk bled gold across the mountains, the forest offered her something no town, no church, no human heart ever had, a presence vast and gentle, a silverback whose dark eyes held the same aching loneliness as her own. In that moment, the world itself seemed to pause, because love, in its purest form, had found a way to breathe where no one thought it could. The dusk settled over the high country like a soft bruise, violet and gold bleeding across the ridgelines as Margaret Whitlow bent low among the ferns. She eased a root from the soil with the practiced care of someone who had learned to listen to the earth more than to people. The leather strap of her gathering satchel creaked against her shoulder, a small sound in the vast hush of the wilderness. The mountains around her exhaled a thin mist that smelled of pine sap and cold stone. She breathed it in and felt it settle somewhere behind her ribs, a familiar ache of solitude that had long since become part of her. The path she followed was no path at all, only a memory of wagon tracks lost to moss and fallen needles. 30 years had passed since she first set foot in these hills with a husband whose laughter once filled the spaces between birdsong. Now she walked alone, silver hair pinned beneath a weathered bonnet, her skirts damp from the evening dew. The forest knew her footfall. It neither startled nor welcomed, simply continued its ancient breathing. And Margaret, for her part, had come to trust the quiet far more than the chatter of any town. A breeze shifted, carrying a scent that did not belong to pine or loam. It was musky, warm, like sun-baked stone after rain. She straightened, a handful of wild ginger clutched in her palm, and listened. No bird sang. No squirrel chattered. The stillness tightened until the pounding of her own heart felt loud enough to give her away. Then came the crack of a branch, sharp, deliberate, close. Margaret turned, her breath hitching, and the world seemed to narrow to a single beam of fading light. From the shadowed undergrowth stepped a creature so large it blotted the twilight. A silverback gorilla, its dark fur threaded with moonlit gray, moved with a quiet gravity that made the forest itself seem to bow. Shoulders as broad as a doorway rolled with each step. The great head tilted, eyes catching the last flare of sun like molten amber. Her first instinct was flight, but her feet rooted to the earth. The stories of travelers torn apart by bears, of mountain lions dragging off livestock, flashed through her mind. Yet nothing about this being spoke of sudden violence. The gorilla paused a dozen paces away, weight balanced, massive knuckles resting lightly in the leaf litter. He regarded her with an intelligence that stole the air from her lungs. Not the dull curiosity of an animal, but a steady, searching gaze, as though he recognized something hidden in her that even she had forgotten. The forest held its breath. Mist curled between them like ghostly ribbon. Margaret's satchel slid against her hip, and an apple, overripe, bruised, tumbled free to the ground. She crouched slowly, every movement deliberate, and picked it up. Her fingers trembled. Without fully knowing why, she held the fruit out before her, palm open. The scent of sweetness drifted across the gap. The gorilla shifted, a ripple of muscle beneath dark fur, and inched closer. The weight of each step made the earth give a faint sigh. Margaret caught the deep, resonant thrum of his breathing, low and patient. He stopped a few paces away, towering above her even in stillness. His nostrils flared, drawing in the apple's perfume. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, they regarded one another, two solitary creatures, separated by species yet bound by something wordless. She felt the years of silence inside her stir, the long nights of talking only to the fire, the endless days of work that no one witnessed. Her husband's grave lay miles behind her, marked by a weathered cedar cross. Friends and family had drifted away with time like leaves on the current. She had thought herself invisible to the world. But in the depths of the gorilla's dark eyes she saw recognition, of loneliness, of endurance, of a life carved out beyond the noise of society. He did not take the apple. He did not need to. After a long, quiet moment, he lowered his head in what felt almost like a bow and released a low rumble, a sound so deep it seemed to vibrate through the trunks of the trees and into her bones. It was not threat. It was acknowledgement. Margaret exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her chest loosening with something like wonder. The light faded, and the first stars pricked the sky. Somewhere in the far distance a coyote called, its lonely cry carrying through the valleys. The gorilla shifted again, a subtle pivot of immense strength, and melted back into the gathering darkness. Branches parted silently to let him pass. Only the faint musk of his presence lingered, warm and wild. Margaret remained kneeling long after he disappeared, the apple still cupped in her palm, the forest returning to its usual chorus of night insects and sighing wind. The rhythm of his slow heartbeat seemed to echo against her own, a memory more physical than sound. When at last she rose, her legs felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath her had changed. The walk home was a dream of shadows and moonlight. She moved carefully along the half-forgotten trail, senses sharpened, each rustle of leaves carrying new meaning. The lantern glow of her cabin flickered faintly through the trees, a distant promise of warmth. Yet she paused often, glancing back into the darkness, half expecting to see two amber eyes watching from the gloom. Inside, the familiar creak of the wooden floor greeted her. She set the satchel on the table, the gathered roots spilling like small secrets. But it was the apple she placed carefully on the windowsill, its bruised skin catching the silver light. She stood there a long time, palms pressed to the cool glass, the night air slipping through the cracks with a faint scent of pine and something deeper, something untamed. Sleep came late. When it did, it carried the rhythm of a low, steady heartbeat, a sound that wrapped around her dreams like a gentle drum. She woke before dawn to the memory of that gaze, those eyes that seemed to know her without a single word. The solitude she had worn for decades no longer fit quite the same. The forest beyond her door was no longer empty. Somewhere out there, a presence waited, and she felt the pull of it like a tide. The first light of morning spilled over the mountains, pale gold on frost-tipped grass. Margaret stepped onto her porch, the apple still on the sill behind her. The forest lay silent, mist rising in slow spirals. She closed her eyes and listened. Far off, beyond the rustle of trees, she thought she heard it again, a distant, resonant hum, like a heartbeat calling across the miles. Seasons folded over the mountains like a slow-turning wheel, and Margaret found herself drawn back to the hidden meadow where twilight had first revealed the great silverback. At first she told herself it was the lure of herbs that grew thick beneath the pines, or the way the creek water there tasted cold and sweet. Yet every time she packed her satchel with fruit and bread, she knew the truth. She was going to see him. He was never where she expected. Some days she would glimpse a shadow rippling through the cedars, the faint tremor of earth beneath her boots. Other times he appeared suddenly, as if conjured from the mist, the silver streak across his back shining like moonlight trapped in fur. She learned to sit quietly on a sun-warmed rock, to lay apples and early berries in the grass, and simply wait. Birds chattered in cautious chorus, the air full of pine and rain, and eventually he would emerge. Each meeting began with distance, a respectful space where they studied one another, the language of patience forming between them. Over time, that space shrank. One autumn evening, as leaves burned gold above their heads, he came close enough that she felt the breeze of his breath. The scent of wild earth and crushed cedar enveloped her. He lowered himself onto his knuckles beside her, a living wall of warmth and quiet strength. When she reached out with a tentative hand, he tilted his head, a deep rumble rising from his chest. It vibrated through the stone and into her bones, not a warning but a sound like the low hum of the earth itself. She answered without words, resting her palm on the cool grass between them, and for a moment the world narrowed to shared stillness. Winter bled into spring, then summer into another fall. Margaret's hair took on the sheen of frost, her hands more lined each year, but she felt a vitality in those hours beside him that no town or church could grant. They became a rhythm of companionship, he foraging along the slope while she hummed the hymns her mother once sang by lamplight. Sometimes he would sit behind her, immense and watchful, the ground thrumming faintly with his heartbeat. When the skies cracked with thunder he remained near, a dark sentinel against the flashes of lightning, while she whispered old frontier prayers that seemed to settle the air between them. As the seasons stretched into years, she began to speak to him in a quiet, almost secret voice. She told him of the two children she had buried before their first birthdays, of the husband whose laugh had once made the woods feel alive, of the endless silence after all of them were gone. He never moved when she spoke. Only the slow blink of his deep-set eyes and the soft rise and fall of his chest answered her, yet his presence carried a solace no human could match. Words were unnecessary, the forest itself seemed to listen. Storms tested that fragile world. One brutal winter a blizzard rolled down from the high peaks, smothering the valley in drifts taller than a man. Margaret's cabin groaned beneath the weight of ice, and a fever gripped her with merciless hands. 4 days she drifted in and out of waking, the fire dying low, her body too weak to fetch wood. On the third night she woke to a heavy thud on the porch and the slow scrape of something vast against the door. Fear pricked through the fever haze, but when she forced herself upright she saw, through the frost-laced window, a massive shape bending to gather fallen branches. Snow swirled around him in ghostly spirals as he stacked the wood by her threshold with careful deliberation. She sank back to her bed, half dreaming, but the steady rhythm of his movements kept her tethered to life. By morning a new pile of logs rested against the door, and great prints marked the snow like dark petals. Each night that followed, the same quiet service continued. Sometimes she heard a low rumble just beyond the wall, a sound that blended with the wind until it became her lullaby. The villagers in the distant valley whispered of enormous tracks near her homestead, but none dared to climb the frozen slope. She did not correct their tales. Some truths belonged only to the mountains. When the thaw finally came, she stepped outside into a world of dripping branches and raw sunlight. Her strength had returned in thin threads, but her heart thudded with a younger vigor. Across the clearing he waited, framed by the dark pines, his silver back gleaming wet in the morning light. Their eyes met, and the weeks of snow and fever folded into silence. She moved toward him, and he toward her, until they stood so near she could feel the damp heat of his breath against her cheek. He touched her shoulder with the back of one immense hand, a gesture so gentle it undid the long ache of her solitude. From that day the bond between them deepened into something both unspoken and unbreakable. She no longer brought offerings as a guest might. Instead she carried food as one would for a companion. They roamed the hills together, the gorilla moving with a quiet dignity while she kept pace along deer trails, her skirts brushing the wildflowers. At times he would lead her to hidden springs or guide her around treacherous slopes, glancing back to be sure she followed. Other times they simply sat beneath the towering hemlocks, the world narrowing to the creak of branches and the pulse of life beneath the soil. Neighbors began to wonder why she spent so many hours beyond the known trails. Children spoke of seeing a dark figure at the edge of the timberline, and hunters found giant footprints pressed into mud like the marks of an ancient legend. Margaret offered only a serene smile when questioned. The secret she carried was too large, too precious for gossip. She felt no need to defend it. The bond itself was defense enough. Years turned quietly. Lines etched deeper across her face, and the gorilla's silver mantle brightened until it shone like the first light of dawn. They remained constant through every season's hardship, he driving off prowling wolves with a single bellow, she mending wounds on his massive arm after a fight with a mountain cat. When she sang the old hymns at dusk, his low harmonies answered, a resonance that seemed to rise from the bedrock itself. Each sound, each shared silence, became a thread in a tapestry neither time nor rumor could tear. On an evening scented with the first bloom of spring, Margaret stood outside her cabin and watched the sky burn with streaks of rose and amber. He waited at the tree line, a dark silhouette against the fading light. She stepped toward him, feeling the ground's quiet pulse through the soles of her boots, and understood that she no longer measured life by the passing of years or the tally of lonely days. She measured it by this steady presence, by the knowledge that whatever the world might name their companionship, it was as real and enduring as the mountains around them.